being able to say no and to hear no is a key element about safety and safe spaces. And there's a great quote, I don't know who said it, it was something like, I'm loving the sound of my feet walking away from things that weren't meant to be.
Welcome back to part B of my conversation with specialist Helen Palmer from Self Unlimited. The conversation's been broken up over two because there are so many great takeaways that we couldn't just shorten anything and leave you out of the fun that we had along the way. So this conversation talks more about rules and relationships. So welcome in. Let's start a conversation that's going to make a difference. This really goes into the rules aspect because I know that's one of the elements here. But I love rules. Yeah. So talk to me about rules because to me that's an essential element about safety.
A context we've possibly missed and is useful to bring at this point. In the Self Unlimited framework, there are 7 responsibilities and they all begin with an R.
Thank you.
So we've been talking about the first one, rain, and now we're talking about the next one, rules. And all of the others have an R as well. So there was an element where I was looking for a word that would kind of say the things that we decide, these big declarations at rain, where do they start to look very tangible as something concrete where the rubber hits the ground? And I'd got a thesaurus out and there were a number of different words, guidelines, protocols, and I went with rules because it's an R. So if people are concerned about that, that's
Makes
okay.
sense.
Throw another synonym in there. But there is an element where I think our lives are ruled, if I play with the word that way, by many things that we have adopted or accepted and unexamined. So things that you might hold, and there's both the values conversation here. So for example, integrity is a value in the sense of values that I hold. Okay, so what does that look like in terms of what I actually do? And part of that then could be translated into rules. It could be seen as habits. What's a kind of guideline or a pattern that I could say about what I do? So I've decided, for example, that a safe space is an important thing for me to have in my workscape and in the conversations that I have. That's a declaration at the rule level. Okay, so what does that actually look like down at the rule level? Well, then I know that I need to be doing things for my self-care and well-being because I cannot, if I don't have a sense of the foundational stuff that's needed for that safety, then I can't show up and be in spaces and create safe spaces for other people. So kind of, take care of business at home. And that might be some things as simple as, particularly as we've talked facilitation, I have some rules about when I'm doing facilitation. I don't look at my email. My phone gets turned off. Those channels get closed down and I will be present in the moment of what's going on. I also make sure that basic things like I'm hydrated, that I'm getting good oxygen. Now that starts to probably feel like, oh, we're getting down in the details. Well, exactly. It's in the details that those rules matter because that's where the rubber's going to hit the road.
To translate that in my head, that's where we feel. So, we can see a lot of these things, but we get down into the nitty-gritty because that's where we feel.
Well, a lot of the senses get involved. What am I going to see? What am I going to hear? What am I going to touch? What am I going to taste? What am I going to feel? All of those aspects are where we are actually living in the moment rather than a broad aspirational statement. It's like something's in front of me. A decision needs to be made. Do I know what decision I'm going to make? And then sometimes it's about having decisions sort of pre-made up. So, which probably sounds a bit odd, but what I'm meaning here is don't leave everything. Well, I say I like uncertainty. That doesn't mean my entire life consists of I've not made any decisions prior. There are a number of things that I know. If I'm going into situation X, then I want the following things in place to be prepared. And that gives me a level of certainty and safety because we don't need to live a life where everything is an open question and every risk gets taken. There's a kind of calculation. So there are certain things it's like, no, I can take care of business by getting those things sorted, which then means for the other stuff that might be important or might be variable or might be constantly changing, I've got the energy, I've got the attention, I've got the emotional context to be able to deal with that.
To me, a lot of those things define perception as well.
Absolutely.
So, because all of our perceptions are completely different, they're made up of all of these learnt behaviours as well as conscious, unconscious biases, judgments, all of these things melting pot into perception. And that's what you're talking about there, isn't it? Is that my uncertainty isn't chaos. My uncertainty isn't something that is scary because I know what I'm turning up with and I value what I turn up with. And so I'm always kind of in the middle of a lot of big stuff that's going on, which I create for myself, but I turn up with a set of tools. I turn up with a pile of resources. I turn up with support.
Yeah.
So.
And some of that is I turn up with the experience of knowing I've survived this before.
Yeah.
I know that there is somebody that I can call. And when I talk about that, and this partly leads into relationships, for me, I have a rule that says if I want to feel safe and express something that's really giving me concern or tension, there are people I do not talk to. And that's, I've identified specific people, but also there's a class or a qualification why not those people.
Which is rules.
Yeah. So I've made a rule. Do not tell and it's partly informed by some of the work of Brene Brown, where she talks about who you don't tell your shameful stories to. So I've taken some cues from that. But I don't tell a story or a event to somebody who wants to show up with the gift of their problem-solving talent. And then they're coming with an open heart and they want to help me. But what I need in that moment is the opportunity to vent. I'm actually very capable and, in fact, pride myself on my own problem-solving capability.
Oh, yes.
If I wanted their problem-solving capability, I would ask for it. And if they were a friend who was kind of like, sometimes I have these conversations with Helen where it's venting, sometimes it's the problem-solving, I don't know which one of these it is, they don't make the assumption and they ask. And that happened recently. So I just need to check, is this the moment where you want to vent or do you want me to help solve the problem? And I went, vent. Great. I'm here. Vent away.
I'm ready to listen.
Yeah.
I'm here.
So, but the fact that I've already identified means that when somebody asks me, oh, how's your day going? Or how's your week been going? I stop and think, were you one of those people I put in the category of be careful what you say, there will be consequences, don't open up too much? Or are you one of those people where I actually feel like I can open up with a full heart and really just say what I need to say? And it's been one of those, I know you asked me to think about for this podcast, what's the greatest lesson to learn? And one is there are people you should not have certain conversations with.
Yeah.
But that's for my own safety. And those people, it's not that they are malicious or there's bad intent. It's in that moment, what it feels to me when they show up with their problem solving when I'm venting is it takes me down a level. It doesn't build me up. It feels destructive in the sense that it's like, well, they're actually saying that there's a problem and I'm a problem and they're going to help fix me. It's like, no, that's not what's going on here.
Do you think it's because people catch what you're feeling and don't know what to do with it?
Oh, indeed. Absolutely. Which partly comes to another notion about figuring out these people is like, do these people understand that what's going on for me right now is just about me? And if I want to really feel the fullness of being safe, I want all the emotions and the emoting to come out, which means the tension's going to be high, the conflict's going to be high, because I'm trying to excise it out of myself. Yeah. And so there are people where it's like, that's just too much for them. And so it's both a consideration of, I don't want to dump on them because they're a friend, they're not a therapist. But there's another rule. If I have something that's needed at that level, go to a therapist.
Right. Yes.
Don't try to treat your partner or your friends as the therapist. If you've got something that's got that level of pain or tension attached to it, get a professional.
No, absolutely. And to be able to recognize that and be self-aware about that, I think is important. Yeah. So we've got this understanding of sovereignty and we've got this understanding of, I create and design what I want this to look like, and that's an evolving, changing thing. We've got this understanding that rules are important and we get to set these rules. Yeah.
And you get to reset them at any point too. You don't have to hold them. If they're not working for you, change them.
So good at that. Oh my God. It's like, I might have had that rule last year, but we're in a different time now.
And it's not working for me anymore.
It's not working. So I'm just going to move on. And so this leads into the relationship aspect.
Yes.
And I think this is the part that I used to struggle with when my mental health was poor, and because there's this disconnection that happens as a result of it. So what do you mean by relationships? What does this look like and how does this turn up in safety? Loaded, sorry.
That's all right.
Let's unpack that.
In a self-unlimited world, it's about understanding that relationships are something that are going to go on around me. Now, if I choose to be mindful and intentional about them, then maybe I can have the relationships that will serve me well. Now, that might be relationships of support. That might be relationships for inspiration. That might be relationships for something functional. That might be relationships to avoid, not only to the ones that I want to have, but it's understanding that I will be in relationship with people, and therefore, which people do I want to be in relationship with, and what quality of relationship do I want to have? And also, how do I show up myself? You know, the relationship's a two-way street. So it's not just what they're going to do for me. It's how am I going to be with them? And I sometimes joke about the notion of having a dance card, which turned out somebody recently told me about their mother actually had a dance card from many years ago in their house. Yes. And so it's the notion that I feel, and maybe it's because I'm an introvert personality, which is not shy and retiring, clearly not, but it's about energy levels. And so how many relationships of a high quality can I maintain? Because I have chosen to say, if you're a relationship of a particular class, then it means I will be investing in you. I will need to be making time to be putting into conversations with you and being present with you. But at the same time, just being mindful about what's going on in your world and connecting. Now, I can't do that for hundreds of people. I can do that for a small group of people.
But I think that's an extrovert thing as well. You know, to be honest, like, you know, I'm not an introvert. Like, I've never been, you know, called an introvert, but I experienced that exact same thing of a lot of my energy is out here all day.
Yes.
It's what I do. My energy is out on display. People can see it. I'm vocal. But to have a relationship, I'm very particular at where I spend personal energy. For that same reason is that it exhausts me.
Yeah.
To have to interact. Like my friends know. It's like, you know, and I've got friends who, you know, yet to be named. I'm looking at her right now. And, you know, that just, and she sets her own boundaries. All my friends set their own boundaries of this is what it's going to look like.
Yes. And that boundary setting is a rule. Yeah. And what reminder
vocalized rule.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's a known quantity. There's clarity.
Yes. So the notion here, we're talking about relationships too. When I'm thinking about from a workscape, this is from the point of view of in my workscape, what relationships do I have? But there's often a crossover where the relationships that you have are also personal because we bring our own person to work. And so for me, you might be listening to this podcast and thinking, oh, I'm talking over here about my personal life. Yes, but this is more about in the workscape because so many things tell us these are the kinds of relationships you're supposed to have. This is how the relationships between employer. This is the relationship that should be between colleagues. This is the relationship you should have between subordinate or colleagues of lesser experience. This is what the relationship you have with people in other organizations who are suppliers or clients. And it's those kinds of relationships that I'm talking about. It's like, well, the organization has a view of what those relationships will be while you're with that organization. But that doesn't mean that's the only nature of those relationships. You, as a person in your workscape, what kinds of relationships do you need and value? And it might be that the organization's not providing those for you. So then where do you go and get them? Now, so often we bring our work into our homes and our friends and our significant others get drawn into our work lives. And there's a part where that's maybe appropriate, but sometimes it's not appropriate. I mean, there's a point where when my husband started parroting some things back to me about the specialty that I'm in, I'm like, wow, I really have been talking about this a lot. You almost could give a presentation on this subject matter. But it was one of those things where I thought, well, you know, that's lovely that there's an interest factor, but there's an element too where it's like, did he actually want to know that much about what was going on in my working life or not? And so, and where are those boundaries? So the boundaries have to be discussed and negotiated with family friends. But he's of a particular view, like it is great that there are professional groups that you can be part of where you can go and have a deeper conversation, where people know what you're talking about and can elevate that to another level. Because I'm sitting here as a non-expert. Yes, I can ask some questions and I love you and I want to hear about your day. But there's a kind of line he wants to draw where it is in terms of what those relationships are.
Which comes down to safety in so many different ways of the safety that we feel for ourselves, that we create around us, but then the safety that we hold for others.
Yes.
And as you've said, that's a negotiated thing, but that we set rules around and we create it to look how we need it to look. So I can see how all of these really intertwine, you know, to what we're talking about when we're having conversations. So it really changes the landscape of a conversation.
And it's both the broader kind of landscape of like, who do I want to be in relationship with? And who do I want to show up for in those conversations? Which is not to say you only look for the people that are going to make you feel good or who are going to inspire you.
Oh, God, no.
But that's part of the declaration of my workscape is that I want diversity. So being mindful that I don't just get the relationships that are in front of me. What relationships do I want to go and seek? Who do I want to actually bring into my village? And I talk about the notion of having a professional village. Who do I want to bring into my village that might enrich a conversation and open me to conversations that I'm not even aware of? And this is where we can start to, because sometimes people think, diversity, inclusivity, that the organization's taking care of that. And I would go, no. I, as an individual over the workscape of Helen Unlimited, are thinking about what's the level of diversity and inclusion in my workscape? Who do I want to bring in? Am I creating a sense or a vibe around me that people feel like, Helen would be a safe space to have a conversation with at whatever level? How do they interact with me?
Does that also inform us of value, like our value? Do we get to kind of see these data points along the way of where our value turns up and what it looks like when we've got those relationships? So we're kind of getting a bit of feedback on it?
Partly, because often in work life, people talk about networking as if that's the kind of relationship that you as an individual have a choice over. And you read different people or hear different conversations about what networking is. And people say, well, it should be something where there's a kind of reciprocity, where something's giving on. So to be in a situation of reciprocity, what you then need to know is, well, I have something of value that I could bring to that conversation or that person. They might have something of value for me. And is there a way that we might exchange? Or is there value I might create for somebody? So I'm incredibly mindful when I'm building relationships in my workscape of, I might have heard somebody talk about something that they were struggling with or that they were interested in. I think, I have value in the sense of there are articles that I've taken note of. Maybe they'd be interested in this article. That sounds like something that might be valuable to them right now. I'm going to share that article with them. Or maybe they're starting out in a new little venture. And I think, I know that it would be valuable to them and their idea for other people to hear about it. I'm going to email that to 5 people that I know and tell them about this so that they expand who is seeing what they're doing. And maybe they might even get somebody who wants to be part of it in some way.
Hi, it's Julie here. I just wanted to take a quick break to say that I'm glad you're here with me. And it would mean the world to me if you could support the podcast by leaving a review or sharing it with someone that you want to start a conversation with. Now, back to the conversation. So there's this idea of, safety is also being mindful of someone else's needs.
Absolutely.
And mindful of someone else's value and the exchange of those values and what it can look like.
And that safety too, not assuming. So I want to build enough of a relationship that I'm not thinking, everybody wants their ideas spread about. So when I don't really consider who you are, it's like, no, Julie. Now, I had a conversation with Julie, and in that conversation, I asked some questions, and I discovered that Julie's got this new idea that she wants to share with the world. And maybe I actually checked in with you, so how's it going getting that message out? I have a network. Would that be of interest? Could I share that with my network? And if you gave me an indication that yes, well, then I've suddenly discovered something that's valuable for you, and I'm of a position to think I can actually do something about that. And I think so many times, and particularly in work relationships, people aren't thinking proactively. They're not thinking, I actually have the ability to help somebody here. What could I actually do? Can I make the offer? And I don't know whether it's that people think, if I offer, I might get rejected. And then, back to safety, I don't want to be rejected. I won't make the offer.
Yeah.
Or I won't ask for what I need because, again, I might get rejected. And I don't feel safe for that. And so, which partly comes back to, I'm worth it kind of element at the beginning of like, well, what's the worst that can happen? They can say no. Okay. Can I cope with, saying, and that's, one of the things I've worked through for myself. What if somebody said no to me? There might be an element where once upon a time I thought, it's all about me. They don't like me. And it's like, well, no, I'm worth it. So, chill.
It's okay.
Yeah. And that people are allowed to say no. And in fact, if they're saying no, chances are they're invoking a rule or a boundary on their side. And that's perfectly valid. Because if I want them to honour mine when I say no, then I equally need to be able to honour them saying no for something on their side.
Because I love hearing a no.
Oh, so do I.
I know.
But you just know where you stand then.
I know.
I really just
and
like
it's honesty.
Yeah, when people say, oh, yes, I'll do that for you. And then I think, okay, so I feel, and this partly comes back to my integrity value. I feel if you said yes to me, then there's a kind of implied commitment or an accountability there. a social contract. And I will then continue to walk through the world and make decisions on the basis that you said yes to me. Now, if you didn't want to say yes to me, I'd much people said, can I just take some time to think about that? That would be perfectly fine with that.
Or I'd love to say yes, but you know what?
Now's not a good time.
Now's not a good time.
Yeah.
But is there someone that I can connect you in with?
Absolutely. All of that has value. But I think people often think, you're the person who asked me right here and now. I'm the only one. The only value I could create was to say yes to you. And it's like, well, no, there are many other ways, which at this point, my husband will often say to me, they were thinking about themselves. They weren't thinking about other things. Many people just don't have the time and energy, which is where I get like, where's the thoughtfulness in the world?
I know. And I declare, very loudly that, it's I don't need yeses. I really don't need yeses. Yeah. I just need someone to tell me where they're at. Because I can't guess. I can't figure it out if someone's saying yes to me.
Well, I think this is being able to say no and to hear no is a key element about safety and safe spaces. And there's a great quote. I don't know who said it. It was something like, I'm loving the sound of my feet walking away from things that weren't meant to be. And I think there are so many, and that, both we're talking about workscape here in a spatial notion, but there's a sense where in saying no to something, I might free up the space for something better. Yeah. And rather than thinking by saying no, and it's one of those things in relationships, you have to be incredibly mindful where you might think, what would be the consequence of saying no in this relationship? And I think if the relationship was strong, had an understanding of the nature of it was, and that there's a give and take, then probably a no will have little harmful consequence in that. But in some relationships, you can't say no. So let's just be pragmatic about that. But there are times when I think people think, oh, well, therefore I'll put a blanket rule in place. I can't say no to anything.
No. Let's talk about that because a lot of people feel they're not in a safe space in the workplace. And that's a whole other soapbox where they feel they can't say no. And part of what I want to do is to be able to have this understanding, this unpacking of, well, how can they get to a place where they can say no a little bit more comfortably? Because my feeling is if I'm saying no, guess what? I'm freeing the opportunity for someone better to do it. Yeah. Or I'm freeing the opportunity for something different to happen that needs to happen. So how did, that position of someone where they don't feel like they have the power, where they're feeling like they have to say yes, how do they get to this point of feeling safe to say no?
I think, first of all, there's this can I hear the word come out of my mouth? No. So start doing it in small things. And it might be just as simple as do you want to come and have coffee with us today? No. And it might be, you might think, oh, but that's not a case where I needed to say no. Well, if you're not comfortable with the words actually coming out of your mouth and hearing them come out and feeling what the discomfort might be in a very low risk situation like that, then that's where to start building it. Can I just say the word no and be okay with it? Also understand that there doesn't have to be this blanket thing between a no and a yes. There is a whole lot of space in between there where it might be a not yet, or if you understand, you might be saying no in terms of, and you gave a good example before, I might not be the person to deliver it, but if you understand what is the person wanting from a yes, they're wanting some kind of outcome. And so I sometimes use a technique called the reverse Q&A. So if somebody said to me, Helen, can I have a cup of coffee? It's a bad example, but this is the one that comes to mind. This reverse Q&A technique would be so if coffee was the answer, what was the question? It's I'm wanting to know how I hydrate myself. Okay, well, I can't do you a coffee, but I can do you a tea. And so just kind of checking in the assumption, because many people often specify something and can sound really kind of clear, and this is what I'm needing or wanting, and it might not be right. But in fact, it might be there's something behind that actually represents what's more valuable to them, and it's got a very tangible form, and I want want a coffee, but what they're actually saying is I want a hydration moment or a break from work or a pleasure. Okay, if you understand that's actually what they're looking for and what's valuable to them, you might be able to deliver that, whereas the coffee might have been out of your reach.
And that reminds me of conversations that I have in coaching and teamwork stuff where there's this assumed thing from a manager, let's say, and there's this assumed pressure, and that someone might feel micromanaged, or they might feel, that their boss is wanting something particularly from them, and they're feeling pressured and uncomfortable and all of this. There's been a couple of situations where I've said, well, have you asked what is wanted? What's the outcome that's expected? And how do you need it to look to know that it's successful. And they've gone, oh, I can't ask that. It's like, well, why not? What's the alternative?
Yeah.
Where people have asked those questions, all of the stuff that was going on in their head and this thought of what it was had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
And within 10 minutes, the air is clear.
Yes.
There's this back onto a good relationship. There's this understanding and this clarity. And
Yes.
guess what? Trust returned very, very quickly.
Yes.
That sense of safety returned very, very quickly because those couple of questions that were asked, and there weren't binary yeses or nos. What does this look like? What does this feel like?
Yeah.
What could this be? What would you want this to be? What does this look like to you? How do you need me to serve this?
And I think there's a showing up there with an intention to, I want to help. So often people think by saying no, it's like, oh, well, actually you're resisting or you're holding a line, you don't want to help. It's like, if you have come with a sense of intention, like I'm seeking to clarify what's required here. Because often if you have somebody in power who says something of what they want, that doesn't necessarily mean they've given it a lot of thought. It's just what first came out of their mouth. And if you've got people in a subordinate position, they tend to think, I must accept that how it is, and then how high must I jump, rather than like, let me just check whether they've thought this through or they've considered, because I can play a role. And this is where part of the self-unlimited notion is, rather than seeing itself as I have a master and a slave, you could think of yourself as I'm a client providing a service. So if I then thought, my client has just asked for something, I'm here to provide service or to serve in some way, not as a slave, but in a servant kind of or serving attitude. So I want to be customer centric. That's a key thing that's been said in lots of workplaces. What is it that they're actually wanting here? Because I will only be valuable if I deliver what's value to them. And if I just gave them the coffee, there might be, it might look on the face of it, tick a box, I gave them what they wanted. But if I didn't really understand what was behind it, which is kind of what they're holding in their mind when they're asking it, then I won't have satisfied them. And then there's a point where I said, yes, I did the thing, gave them the cup of coffee, and they're not feeling as grateful as I thought they should be because I, met that performance. But it's like, but I failed to actually understand there was something more. And I think that there's a situation I can recall when I was on a project and many of the team were frustrated because the project manager kept asking for a report. And they're like, but we've only just been here 3 weeks, Helen. We don't know where things are at. We don't know what, and it was a report sort of plan about what actually needed to happen over the next 3 months. And like, but we don't understand yet what's going on. And he keeps asking for this plan/report. And so I said, okay, let's do this reverse QA question. So if the report was the answer, what was the question? And so they played around with a few questions then about, well, to know what's going on or to know what might be going to happen in the next few months. Okay, how can we answer that question? And they went, we could provide some information in the following ways and give an update. Okay, so if we understand that's actually what the person wanted, then we can provide those updates. This person's gone to a shorthand and said, I want it as a plan, and you've all interpreted a plan as a particular thing. But really, what's behind that is I'm seeking some knowledge and insight about what's going to happen over the next few months because I need to do some planning for myself, and that's an input. So then it changed the whole dynamic in terms of rather than like, oh, this person keeps asking for a plan, we're avoiding their calls, we don't want to be participating. It's like, oh, now I understand more what they're asking for.
There's this sense of our assumptions get in the way of us feeling safe.
Indeed.
But
we do it. We think we're being safe by holding that. If we hold those assumptions, then we will act in ways that keep us safe within whatever that bubble is of those assumptions. Whereas we don't actually open to the possibility of there could be another version of safety here, which could be we could be seen as valuable or delivering value. But we're so held in this bubble of a particular assumption, we're not open to the fact there could be another version of safety here.
But when we sit in that as bubble of assumed, we're actually kind of covering our heads and covering our eyes.
Indeed, we're cocooning.
We're cocooning because we're not going to see what safety how expansive safety can be.
Yeah. By asking a question, it might feel risky, but in fact, actually, there could be a different level of safety that's more than cocooning. It could be more that I can stand in my truth. I can stand with my head held high. I can look at the world and not feel that I'm needing to protect myself. And I think many people think that notion of safety is like that cocooning effect rather than actually safety is I'm standing in my truth. I'm not fearing consequences because I'm in a conversation to understand what the consequences might be or what I am actually accountable or responsible for.
Because that's, you talked about Brene Brown earlier and, that's what she calls the armor that we have. Whereas the armor might have served a purpose over the years. It might have been something useful for protection or for whatever reason. but it actually gets in the way of us connecting into expansive safety, and connecting in with relationships and actually owning our truth, owning our power. And we think rules hold us in that armor, but they don't. They're blocking us from being able to access our rules.
And particularly to the point we were saying before, if you've come up with some rules and you weren't even sure that you came up with some rules, well, first of all, kind of like, have I got rules in play here? Okay. Are those rules serving me? No. Or they serve me in some circumstances, not others. And people might go, oh, that's all getting a bit complicated. Well, this is the messy, complex nature of these things. Some things will work in some places and not others.
Yeah.
And so much is contextual. And so that's where some of that preparation work is. If I just sit back in a quiet moment where nothing is impinging on me or in a tense moment and requiring particular attention from me, and in that quietness say, what's important to me? What does that actually look like? What do I need to have in place? And in that quiet, still place, have a sense of what those rules or those features are that will give you safety, and then go from there. Now, and as I said before, it's not a case of saying, oh, I did it once, I'm done. It'll be like,
no.
Then you can get in a habit of saying, okay, I know what it is to be mindful about what's in place. I can actually then consider and evaluate, is this working for me? And that doesn't have to be go off on a retreat for a weekend kind of find a safe space. Well, that does. But it could just be a 10-minute conversation with yourself. And because that's another thing. Conversations can be with yourself.
Yeah.
And 10-minute conversation with yourself over a cup of coffee in a cafe somewhere.
Because that leads me to, and we can talk all day about this. That leads me to a couple of questions because I want to wrap this up because there's a lot in here for, I think, people to digest. And I think there needs to be a second part to all of this to go into the other R's. And I want to kind of hit you up for that.
Sure.
But I want to ask a couple of questions. And these are going to feature in most of the interviews. These aren't interviews. Conversations that I have. And so I'm just going to hit you up. And first thing that comes to mind is fill in the blank. A conversation can
be a dance.
I love that.
There's a give and a take. There's a backwards and a forwards. There's a fluidity. And which is not to suggest that there's a preset dance, but there's a sense where you're flowing and moving with whatever space that you have and you're paying attention to the responses of the partner with you're dancing with.
Okay. What has been the greatest lesson, good or bad, that you've learned about having a conversation?
That what you need to say is not necessarily what somebody else needs to hear. And sometimes you just need to have a conversation with yourself or an unattached third party. I think there's a sense of, that sometimes we think we need a conversation because we want to be seen and heard. And it's like, but does anybody need to see or hear that?
No. What is something you would like others to know about having difficult conversations?
That a ritual helps you get into a good mindset if you're about to enter a difficult conversation. And by ritual, I don't mean something that you might see ceremonial in a religious or ceremony, but just a simple thing about, okay, I know I'm about to have a difficult conversation. I have a bit of a checklist that I run through. It's like, am I hydrated? Make sure I've got water in my system because my blood will actually needs the water to flow and well. Have I got good oxygen supply going on? Do I need some deep rest? Is my husband available nearby for a hug? Because sometimes that's just a bit of an emotional support. If he's not nearby, is there something that I can look at that gives me some pleasure or joy, that's an emotion that I can add to my repertoire as I go into that with all the other mix of emotions? And am I clear what kind of outcome I'm looking for from this? And therefore, if I do, I need an exit strategy. So it's kind of like I almost feel like game on, but it's like for game on, there's a couple of things I just need to do and run through and check before I enter the difficult conversation.
Game on, but I'm taking all that I have into it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation. Once again, I've learned a lot. I always do when I share space with Helen Palmer. And thank you for being generous of, jumping into this with me, first up and, to get on board. Really appreciate it and really appreciate you.
Well, for me too, the conversation brings out things I'm like, really? I didn't know I was thinking that, which I think is the power of conversation. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks. Thank you for listening to the second part of this conversation. Once again, there are so many takeaways, which is why we split this particular one into two with Helen Palmer. One of the biggest takeaways was the combination, I guess, of the two rules, or two responsibilities of rules and relationships, because we talked about sitting in uncertainty compared to, certain misery. And even with my experience and lived experience of, mental illness, I would still much prefer to sit in uncertainty than certain misery. And I think that's for me where hope sat. Because when my uncertainty isn't chaos, because I'm turning up with support. And that's a huge difference in it. Those relationships have been really profound for me. So I just wanted to share that, that was my particular takeaway. More of the takeaways from the episode will be on the website. And I really look forward to listening to your ideas and your takeaways from these. So please leave it in comments or review. And we look forward to your support. Don't forget to share this episode with someone that you want to start a conversation with. Thanks for listening.